Welcome to the Hour of Truth, the Central Valley Leadership Roundtable Special Edition. Joaquin Murrieta. Who was he? The most famous 49er of all time. He's been overlooked by many historians, but today we have the authority on Joaquin Murrieta. Anybody out there that wants to write a movie and film a movie, you need to talk to author, historian Humberto Garza. Bienvenido.
Thank you for the introduction. Joaquin Murrieta is one of the characters that has about 50 to 17 books written about him. Most of them are inaccurate because most of the authors thought that there was only one person named Joaquin Murrieta. And actually, it took me years to find out, about 11 years of research, but there were actually 3 Joaquin Murrietas, and they were cousins. And they had, 2 of them had the same grandfather, and the other one had, the grandfathers were brothers, so he was a second cousin. And they all rode together, and they all came to California in 1848, and they all came doing the gold rush. His brothers, 2 of his brothers were already here working in Vallejo. And when the gold rush came to California in January of 48, his brothers were among the first ones to go, so they rode to Joaquin, who was living in Sonora, Mexico at the time.
Permíteme, so ya ven, Joaquin Murrieta en 1848, con la fiebre del oro, todos queremos buscar esa mejor manera de vivir, como muchos emigrantes hoy. Y como nos dice el historiano, autor de los libros, Humberto Garza, es la autoridad. Si van a hacer la película, tenemos que hablar con él, pero lo que nos está indicando que había varias personas que se llaman Joaquin Murrieta. So ahí empieza.
Y vinieron juntos y llegaron aquí como en marzo del 48. Fueron uno de los primeros que llegaron al Motherlode. Fueron los californios que ya estaban aquí. Y segundo fueron los sonorenses que estaban más cerquitas. Y después de esos llegaron gente de Colombia, de Chile, de Argentina. Y al último llegaron los anglosajones que venían del East Coast of the United States. And the reason for that was because he took news of the gold strike 7 months to go from San Francisco to the East Coast. That's the travel time by boat. Across by horse, you had to do it also in 7 months. So by the time they came back, it was already 1849. So that's why they call them 49ers, because they got here almost a year after the gold had been discovered. In fact, 14 months after gold was discovered.
Pues déjame preguntarte, ¿por qué muchos historiadores, escritores no le han dado su lugar a Joaquin Murrieta? ¿Por qué esconden esta historia?
Una de las razones es porque sabían que era mexicano y la discriminación ha existido contra los mexicanos aquí en Estados Unidos antes de la guerra de Estados Unidos y México. Y era muy fuerte. Los mexicanos ya estaban aquí. Por eso tenemos estados como Nuevo México, Nevada y California, y Texas, son Florida, son nombres españoles. Y ya estábamos aquí. Y la cosa es que nos echaron fuera, o trataron de echarnos fuera, y unos se fueron y otros se quedaron, a unos los mataron. La cosa es, we're still here, and the discrimination has still existed. You know, we are not necessarily immigrants to this country. We've been here a long time ago. In fact, in one of my books that I researched on the Aztecs used to live in Utah 3,300 years ago. That's how long Mexicans have been here in the United States that we can document in history. So anybody that claims to have indigenous blood like we do, most Mexicans, most of us have at least 25% indigenous blood. You know, our ancestors have been in this country for over 3,300 years. And yet they look at us like we just jumped the fence last week. Like.
Well, there's a historian that wrote a book that Joaquin Murrieta never existed. I'm sure you know Mr. Bruce Thornton, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And he asserts that it's just our imagination that we created this folk hero. Era una leyenda, like you said, demystifying the Joaquin Murrieta legend. 14 years of investigation, 14 años de investigación. Dinos por qué la gente, unos escritores dicen que no existió, but yet he's the most famous, talked about 49ers of all time.
Well, the reason he came to that conclusion was basically that he was doing the analysis of the newspapers of the time. And the papers had him robbing people in Sacramento and in Stockton and then in Los Angeles in the same day. He says he couldn't have existed. How can somebody by horse travel from Stockton to Los Angeles to Sacramento on the same day? You can't do that. Even within a day, you can't do that. So he must have been made up, and that's how he came up with the idea. But he didn't know that there were three of them, and that's one of the mistakes. In my early research, there was a thesis that was also written by an Anglo historian, and he came up with the same premise, the same hypothesis that Joaquin didn't exist because he couldn't have done all these things at the same time, being at that many places at the same time, and Thornton had suffered from the same delusion.
Sí, había muchos que se llamaban Joaquín, ¿verdad? Muchos Joaquín Carrillo, Joaquín Murrieta, Joaquín Valenzuela. Y claro, pues ese escritor, el señor Bruce, dijo, pues, ¿cómo va a estar robando en San Francisco y acá en Mariposa, Calaveras County? ¿Y cómo va a estar acá en Los Ángeles?
Yeah. Well, the most popular names for males in the Spanish language is Jesus, who's named after Jesus, Jose, who was his father, and Joaquin, who happened to be his maternal grandparent, last name, first name. So his maternal grandparents were Ana and Joaquin, and that's why it's such a popular, Spanish name. And it basically all of us are good Catholics, and like good Catholics, we name our kids after Catholic saints when we can.
Yes. Miren, from all the books that I've read, this book is unmatched in citing sources of the history and definitely also the history here in the San Joaquin Central Valley. We have a rich history in Fresno County porque Joaquín Murrieta anduvo por todo San Joaquín, por Fireball, cruzó el río de San Joaquín cuando lo estaban persiguiendo capitán Harry Love, que era el capitán de los Rinches con 19 hombres. Tell us, historian Humberto Garza, people want to know what happened at the Gun Battle of Cantua, 1853, July 25th. Now, I know you don't want to call it a gun battle because it was an unmatched or unmatched in regards to gunmen, a small group against a force. Tell us about it.
Well, it actually, the way it happened is far from a battle. In fact, the report from the California Rangers at the very end, when they reported to the state what had happened in Cantua Creek, they said they turned in 5 pistols and says that's what we found, 5 pistols. And how can you have a battle? The Rangers, there were 20 Rangers and about 60 volunteers that were after riding with Captain Love at the time. How can you have a battle against 80 people against 5 pistols? How can you have a battle that way? You can't.
Okay, the other controversy. I don't know about anybody more controversial than Joaquin Murrieta that evokes a lot of emotion. Este personaje es controversial. Ese día, 1853, julio 25, fue decapitado Joaquín Valenzuela, a lo que yo he leído. Y también el brazo derecho de Joaquín Murrieta, Manuel Duarte, Three Finger Jack. ¿Por qué el capitán Harry Love dijo, este es Joaquín Murrieta? Yo sabía y tenía alguien que lo podía identificar ese día.
Well, the motive for even making up Three Finger Jack. He's actually fictional. There was a person, but that wasn't his name or his nickname either. There was a $1,000 reward that was offered by the state of California for the head of Joaquin Murrieta. When he first offered the reward, the $1,000 to us today doesn't sound like much money. But if you had to convert it to cash, $1,000 from 1852 to today, that would be somewhere between $250,000 to $300,000. That's a lot of money. So there were a lot of people motivated to find Joaquin Murrieta. And the state offered, they offered 5, they knew there were at least 5 people named Joaquin that they wanted decapitated, and they had a $1,000 reward on each. Well, when they had the battle at Cantua, they didn't find any Joaquins there. They didn't find any. Actually, they did kill one. Joaquin Valenzuela was killed, but they didn't decapitate him because the Rangers used him for target practice. And the reason we know this is because when they dug up his body years later, and they weeks later, when they actually buried him, because they just left him out there, there were 13 bullet holes in his skull. You know, the only way you do that is close range, and like, why will you fire 13 bullet holes into somebody's skull? And that was Joaquin Valenzuela. The person they did decapitate, and his name was Juan Valenzuela. Juan Valenzuela was the older cousin de Joaquin Valenzuela, and he was in charge of that the Cantua station. It was a Mustang station, and they used to collect Mustangs from all the valleys in San Joaquin Valley, and then they would herd them. They get a herd of about 350 horses, and they would drive them to Mexico, about 600 miles. And one way, and then they would sell them over there, and then they would come back for more. And Juan Valenzuela was in charge of that, and for the Murrieta organization, and he's the one that they have in the jar. That's the head they have in the jar. Three Finger Jack, the Mustang runners, and there were a lot of them that rode with Joaquin Murrieta. One of the accidents that happen to Mustang runners a lot is when you rope a Mustang and you throw the lasso, this little finger is the one that guides it, and you ride it around the saddle horn like this. But and you're going like down like this to the rope around the saddle horn, if the Mustang hits it before you threw, it'll just cut it. And that he didn't have this finger. And a lot of the Mustang runners were missing this finger because that was a very common accident.
Pues ya lo ven, cómo salió el personaje de el famoso Tres Dedos, Jesús Duarte, Manuel Duarte, donde usaban el lazo, y cuando atrapaban a esos musteños silvestres, si les ganaba o patear el musteño,
yeah,
les cortaba el dedo. Entonces de ahí surge el famoso o la leyenda del Tres Dedos que acompañaba a Joaquín Murrieta.
His name was actually Manuel Duarte, and Manuel Duarte had this accident, and he was a Mustang runner, and the thing that they cut off his head, and they said all Mexicans look alike. They cut off his head, and they said, we'll turn it into the state. The state doesn't know, and they call him Three Finger Jack, because they cut off the hand, his hand and his head, and they thought the state would pay on it. But the state didn't pay on that one.
Pues miro la conveniencia que el capitán de los Rangers, Harry Love, le cortó la mano a cualquier mexicano hubiera sido. En este caso fue Manuel Duarte, Manuel Duarte, donde
y la cabeza también.
Y para reclamar la recompensa,
Yeah.
que sería en esos $1,000.
Actually, his name was Manuel Duarte.
Manuel Duarte, sí.
Yeah, and he became the famous three-finger Jack, supposedly.
Sí, y mi hijo Mesli le encanta que le cuente y le lea el libro de Joaquín Murrieta y siempre me preguntó, Dad, who was Three Finger Jack? And I'm glad because he wants to read. We need to make sure we encourage children to read, to read about early California history, Alta California como era llamado en ese tiempo. Pero déjenme decirles cómo pueden comprar este libro. Tenemos aquí el autor que se lo puede firmar y dedicar. Pueden ir a ordenarlo en línea a Humberto Garza, subrayado 2010 a yahoo.com. ¿Ok? Humberto Garza, subrayado 2010 @yahoo.com. Okay, so Humberto Garza _2010 @yahoo.com. Usted puede recibir este libro. Si lo quiere autografiado, pues le podemos pedir aquí al autor, no creo que se niegue, lo puede comprar. Tenemos el teléfono, si me permites dar tu teléfono al aire. Su teléfono al aire aquí, área 559-250-9144. For those that want to call him directly to order it and dedicate it, autograph, you may call area code 559-250-9144. And let me tell you, there is no one that has researched more than 14 years. That's a big commitment in trying to demystify the Joaquin Murrieta legend. And obviously there's still a lot of controversy out there. But let me ask you, was he a bad hombre? ¿Era un hombre malo, como la gente dice?
Well, when he first came here, he was married, he had a young wife, and he was a hardworking young man, he was a decent young man. It's very, very, very much oriented towards his family, and he was the fourth son of 6 sons, and he obeyed his older brothers and his father and his parents. And but when they gang raped his wife, and then
Rosita Carmelita.
Her name was Carmen. Okay.
Carmen.
Yeah, people call her Rosa. I don't know why, but her name was Carmen. Carmen Feliz. Before she married, and she was about 8 months pregnant when they killed her. Actually the 49ers that lynched his brother, there were about 42 in the mob, and they beat her up because she fought him off as best she could because she didn't want to get raped, and they beat her up, and they formed a line and they gang raped her, and in the process, she aborted the child that she had was 8 months. Like I said, she was 8 months pregnant, and she aborted the child, and then a day later, she actually bled to death.
Sí.
But what happened though after that was, and his brother, the same incident, his brother was lynched. And when he went to the sheriff 3 days later after he had recovered from the beating, because he was horsewhipped and left for dead, when he recovered, he went to the sheriff of Calaveras County and he asked for justice. And because he knew these 49ers that had done this, because they were just like him, they were working the mines, and they were right next to each other in the creeks. So he knew who they were. And the sheriff told him that he couldn't do anything for him. And Joaquin asked him for, and this is where this law that had existed in California since 1850 legally, it was called Civil Section 394 of the state of California, actually said that a person who was feeble-minded, or a person who was younger than 8 years of age, or a person who had 1/4 Indian blood, or a person who was half black or black, could not testify against a white person in a court of law.
Eso es muy importante. Déjame, por favor, explícanos Porque nuestra audiencia dice, ¿por qué era que no podía ir Joaquín Murrieta a pedir justicia? No, recuerda que en Stockton, California, en ese tiempo, le habían ahorcado a su hermano y habían golpeado a su esposa, había sido golpeada y abusada.
Yeah, como te expliqué, it was assumed that anybody that was Mexican was at least 1/4 Indian, had at least 1/4 Indian blood. So therefore, he was not eligible. The law prohibited him from filing charges or testifying against a white person. So the white person couldn't be charged.
Sí, entonces, cuéntanos por qué ahorcaron al hermano de Joaquín Murrieta, a Jesús Murrieta en Stockton.
Well, he had actually bought 2 mules from one of the gold miners that was there, and he bought them because he needed them to carry loads. And when the mob came after him, and as he had spent the money, he came over and they accused his brother Jesus of having stolen the 2 mules. And he had actually bought them, and he told him, I bought them from you. You already drank the money, but I bought them from you. And then the guy called him a liar, and then they accused him of being a horse thief, and they actually lynched him for that. The mob actually lynched him for that. And when Joaquin came out to help his brother, they beat him up, and then his wife came out to help his Joaquin, and then they tore off his clothes, and they threw him on the ground, and they gang raped her. And they even formed a line, and some of them came back and did it twice.
Now, I asked you earlier, was Joaquin Murrieta a bad hombre? So in the process of him seeing his brother lynched, influence.
Well, he was alive when this happened because they beat him up and they tied him up to an oak tree and they were horse whipping him when his wife was being raped and his brother was being lynched. He saw all of this, and he knew who they were. So when 3 days after he recovered, he went to the sheriff to get justice and see what they could do. And the sheriff said, I can't do anything for you. These are white people. Mexicans cannot file charges against white people.
Y la ley, como tú dices, es 391 sección.
394, yeah.
394, esa sección de la ley no permitía a cualquier persona que tuviera cierta cantidad o pequeña cantidad de sangre indígena. Entonces Joaquín Murrieta no podía obtener justicia. Entonces, de ser un buen hombre de familia, he didn't become a bad hombre.
Well, no, he actually thought about it for a couple of days because the sheriff told him, the best you can do is just forget about it. And he went home and he told his brothers and he told his cousins and his friends, and they decided they were going to get their own justice. And his brothers helped him and his cousins helped him. And then he went after all of them, and he got 41 of them. They actually got 41 of them, and they actually were going to lynch him, but they said, Joaquin told them, no, we're not going to lynch him. We're not going to give him a tree. That's what they did to my brother. We're going to lynch them like the snakes they are. We're going to lynch him on the ground. And they said, well, how do you lynch somebody on the ground? And he says, let me show you. He got on his horse, he put a noose around their neck, and then he dragged them on the ground until the head popped.
Entonces, cuando miró Joaquín Murrieta que no podía obtener justicia por las cortes o por el sheriff, entonces él habló con sus primos familiares y dijo, vamos a buscar estos 42 hombres, en sus ojos, malos hombres,
yeah,
y vamos a ahorcarlos arrastrados. Entonces,
los arrastraron hasta que el peso del cuerpo es tanto que el mecate realmente corta o desconecta el pescuezo.
Y escribes que por eso sale el condado de Calaveras.
Yeah.
Por las calaveras que de tantas muertes que hubo.
Hubo de perdida 41.
41 de los 42.
Ya, y el 42, ya después que se fue para México. Después del 53 se fue para México, y cuando estaba allá, fue 3 veces, fue para Tennessee y a buscar el chavo ese que le faltaba. Y cuando le pregunté al que estaba ahí en Sonora, le pregunté al descendiente de Joaquín, le dije, bueno, y ya nunca fue. Dice, no, ya después de la 3ª vez ya no fue, dice, yo creo que lo mató.
Pues ya vamos a ver, pero miren, los conocimientos de caballería, gente de a caballo, mis respetos, que los que saben de jinetes, les voy a confesar, yo me subí a un caballo últimamente en el verano para la famosa cabalgata marcha de Joaquín Murrieta por Justicia y tuve una experiencia donde me caí del caballo, pero ¿saben qué? Los jinetes me dijeron, mira, Eliseo, la lección más difícil es saber caerse y levantarse, entonces vas a un buen camino para ser jinete. ¿Cómo la ves?
Así es.
Sí,
Así es.
Entonces, porque Joaquín Murrieta era un buen hombre de familia, se transformó en el proceso, porque recuerden que en esa época de la fiebre del oro, no podías ir al banco y depositar el oro que has encontrado. Entonces, él tomó venganza o justicia por sus propias manos. Tienes ese libro, tu primer libro, Joaquín Murrieta, A Quest for Justice. ¿Cuánto tiempo duraste en escribir ese libro y luego qué te motivó a escribir tu segundo libro, verdad, de Demystifying the Joaquín Murrieta Legend, demistificando la leyenda de Joaquín Murrieta?
El primer libro fue muy dificultoso porque leí todo lo que existía, artículos, newspaper articles, and every book that's been written on him. And there were too many conflicting stories, just too many. And it took a long time to actually break down the puzzle y todo. Frank Letta was one of the Bitterwood books, and he had come up with the idea that he started off writing this book with maybe one Joaquin Murrieta in place, and then he actually suspected that there might be a second Joaquin Murrieta, and he wasn't sure though. And before he finished his book, though, Frank Letta died, and it was his daughter that actually had to finish it off and put the final points together. And he used the information Letta had, but it was not necessarily in the order it should have been. And that took a while to sort out also. But after I finished the first book, after the 11 years, and I put it out, family members from Bakersfield, from Fresno, from Los Angeles, and then from Sonora, actually, they invited me to their homes, and they invited me to the state of Sonora, Mexico, and I went, and I sat down with them, and they gave me so much information that I had to write a second book. And it was in the process of writing the second book and talking with the relatives that I discovered that there were actually not 2, as Letta suspected, but there were 3 Joaquin Murrietas. And we found that third family also. Actually, the family, some of the descendants that helped me actually lived right there in Fireball.
Is that right?
Yeah, but they were going by the last name. They had changed their last name from Murrieta to Amado. And the way it happened is kind of funny because Joaquin Murrieta Jr. was born in 1850 in Fireball. Actually, grew up in Mexico, and then he grew up in Mexico, but he came back to here with his mom. And they lived in Hanford for a long while. And they also committed a couple of crimes, and they were wanted by the state. So Joaquin Murrieta Jr. actually left the country and went to visit his dad, who at that time was living in Brazil. And his dad told him, if you guys are wanting for murder, because Brazil might not be far enough. So he went to the Azores, and he lived over there for about 3 years. He got married, had some kids, and then he decided to come back to the United States, but he came back as a Portuguese immigrant, speaking Portuguese now. And he changed his name to Manuel Amado. And then he immigrated as Manuel Amado, but his real name is Joaquin Murrieta Jr. And his kids were raised here in Hanford because they left the Azores. When they became young men, they came looking for him also, and they grew up in Hanford, but they were already going by Amado. They went by Amado.
Muy interesante, very interesting. No puede existir, ¿verdad? Este tipo de programa que trae gente especial de este calibre, como lo que es escritor Humberto Garza. Mis respetos, su dedicación en buscar la verdad, y es en la hora de la verdad no podemos hacer estar más agradecidos con su presencia. Quiero dar ahorita rápidamente un anuncio a García's Market de Kerman por el apoyo al programa. García's Market, donde encuentra de todo tipo de comida, Fresno, Self-Fix, que hay una localidad en Fresno, en Hanford, Ramon's Tire Shop en Mendota, Don Pepe's Fireball, esos coctelitos, tostadas de camarón riquísimos, Manuel Tire Shop, en Fireball, Alex Auto Repair, Mendota, familia y amigos, restaurante de Mendota, el rincón del sabor mexicano, Madera. No nos olvidemos, tenemos a Black Zócalo Instagram para los que tienen su granja y están necesitados. Ellos proveen ayuda, búsquenlos en Instagram. Luz Beauty Salon en Mendota, restaurante Flor de Michoacán, allá por la bella ciudad de Carruthers. Bad Ash Haircut en Mendota, la asociación de peluqueros y estilistas. Pónganlos a trabajar, abran esas puertas. Tenemos que mantener nuestras familias. A Arámbulas Taquería, González Tire Shop and González Towing. Well, la organización que se especializa en abogar por agua limpia para nuestras familias. Pero regresemos al tema más controversial. ¿Por qué causa tanta controversia con Joaquín Murrieta y it evokes so much controversy and emotion? What's your take?
Well, I've been approached by several people that want to make a movie on Joaquin Murrieta and all that, but after all the work that I did in the research, I always place some conditions on them. If they're going to do a movie, they have to mention Civil Section 394 of the state of California. Because if it wasn't for that, Joaquin Murrieta would never become a bandit. He never would become a killer. And if they don't mention that law, then they're not telling the story. Second one is, they didn't kill him. They did not cut off his head. He died of old age. All three cousins named Joaquin Murrieta died of old age. One was Joaquin Murrieta el Famoso, died in Sonora. He was 80 years old. Joaquin Murrieta el Güero, he died when he was 90 years old in San Paulo, Brazil. And Joaquin Juan Murrieta, he died in El Paso, and he was 112 years old. He died of old age, all of them. And they said, if they do the movie, they gotta do those two things: that they didn't kill him, and they gotta mention that law. And most of them kind of back off after that because they wanna continue with the story that they cut off his head. They didn't. He died of old age.
Ya lo escucharon aquí en la hora de la verdad. Muchas veces los que quieren escribir o quieren filmar, ¿verdad? La filmación de una película de Joaquín Murrieta, cuando hablan aquí con nuestro escritor y autoridad, con la verdad, entonces a veces se desaniman porque exigimos o exiges que lo hagan usando la verdadera historia.
It's difficult for them. They find it very difficult to have to say, this is how racist we were in 1850. That it was legal for a white man to rape a Mexican woman, to kill a Mexican man, and it was legal. That's how racist it was. Now, they don't do that to us anymore, but there's still a lot of discrimination. But they have to admit that, this goes back many years, and it's still not over. like we need to look at our history so that we can understand how we got to where we are today. They didn't just start discriminating against us right now. It's been happening for a long time.
So, and there was also other laws like the Foreign Minors Act that prohibit, Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants,
Well, the Chinese,
or any other.
and the Chinese, they actually passed a law, and they made it illegal for Chinese to file a claim on any land that had not already been prospected. So they couldn't work a new claim. They could only work old claims. They could file a claim on somebody else's after they didn't want to work it anymore. And I suspect that very strongly that why Chinese went into the providing services like laundries and cooking and all of these other things because they didn't let them work. They didn't let them prospect for gold like everybody else.
Yeah, so definitely at that time there was that civil section law that you mentioned, 394.
Right.
So in order to understand,
there's examples of this law in practice. In fact, a Chinese witness, an Anglo, killed 3 other Anglos and robbed them. And then they went. It's called Hall versus State of California, and it's a very famous law. And when the judge dismissed the case because the Chinese, although they were not mentioned in Civil Section 394, they said it was the intent to include all minorities. Therefore, a Chinese could not be a witness against a white person in a court of law. So this white person that killed 3 white people also got away with it.
Entonces, esa ley de los 1800, la sección 3, ley 394, sección, ¿verdad? Aquí en Alta California o California, era la que se usó para que no pudiera testificar cualquier persona de otra raza que no fuera blanca contra
otra persona blanca.
Sí, contra. Entonces es muy importante de verlos de esa perspectiva, porque muchas veces ahorita no van a comprender eso.
Well, when I was teaching, a lot of the kids would say, well, I wish I had lived at that time. And I said, no, you wouldn't. Like, how would you like to have your mother raped while you were walking? How would you like to have your sister raped in front of you? You can't do anything. And it was legal, and they did that, and they could do that and get away with it, and they did it.
So all the research, there you have it. 5 books you have already, Humberto. That's a big commitment to document the history.
Well, it's our American historians haven't done a very good job of documenting Mexican American history in the United States, and somebody's got to do it. If we don't do it, they're not going to do it for us. They already proved that. They haven't done it. They had years to do it. They haven't done it. So either we do it or it doesn't get done.
Sabemos que en tu libro, Demistificando la leyenda de Joaquín Murrieta, hay muchos jinetes comprometidos para que no se olviden de quién era este famoso minero, el más famoso Joaquín Murrieta, Sigurdur Kristoffersen. Cuéntanos, le dedicaste totalmente un capítulo a esta famosa cabalgata que va más de 40 años y sigue esa tradición.
Well, era importante because, la intención de Chris Kristoffersen was good intentions, he didn't have the right information, but his intentions were good. His intentions were very honorable, and that was one of the least things that I could do. It's give some credit to some people trying to do some good.
Sí, yes, Sigurdur Kristoffersen wanted to be part of or connect Joaquín Murrieta to some of the injustices that were experiencing.
That still exists today, yes, and that's why he started the cabalgata. And if you use that as a criteria to any injustices in California, we should have a bigger cabalgata because, we still have a lot of injustices here in the state of California.
Well, if we look now in the Central Valley, we know that the Hispanic population, as well as our African American brothers and sisters, are the ones that are being hit the hardest with COVID-19. I want to thank Dr. Joaquin Arambula, which his father named our 31st District Assemblyman, Dr. Joaquin Arambula, based on the name of Joaquin Murrieta. And this year, for the first time, he rode a horse from Firebaugh all the way to Mendota, California, en apoyar, ¿verdad? Y traer la atención de las necesidades de las áreas rurales. Un saludo al doctor Joaquín Arámbula, te respetamos, gracias por convivir y conectarte con nuestras familias. Mira, allí tomé esa foto a caballo, que todavía llevas esa causa por justicia, para que traigan más pruebas del COVID-19, para que traigan esos fondos. Un gran líder, me quito el sombrero, muchas gracias. Regaló más de 8,000 máscaras. En ese tiempo, muchos de los eventos no se llevaron a cabo, pero miren, como pueden ver, los jinetes vinieron a apoyar a los que iban a marchar. Muchos querían guardar su distancia y protegerse, pero muchos dijeron no, tienen que seguir. Estos son retratos anteriormente. Aquí podemos ver una demostración cómo se escondía a veces Joaquín Murrieta atrás de su caballo. Perdimos a José Manuel Ornelas al COVID-19. Se nos fue el alcalde, Mr. Mendota, Robert Silva, que siempre apoyó esa cabalgata, y el COVID no asustó a Stan Santos, que organizó la marcha hace 3 años. Thank you, Mr. Santos. More than 8,000 masks were given for us to protect families. So we have to make sure that in working with the county, I want to thank our health department, the county, for allowing us to do an open door safe, following all the protocols, because we can still operate COVID or no COVID, but we need to protect families and educate our people. Pero tell us, what do you think that this tradition of La Cabalgata has endured all these years, and now we're using it to promote a lot of social justice?
Well, there's a lot of people that like horses, okay? And then it's an excellent place for them to show the horses, show the horsemanship, and also they can tie it up with doing something good. It's part of our tradition, it's part of our culture, and I grew up in a ranch, so I can identify with that. We were riding horses since we were 2 years old, 3 years old. So the thing is, it's very expensive to keep a horse.
Yes. So there you have it. Sigurdur Kristofferson, his legacy continues beyond. We hope you rest in peace, but the tradition continues because all those years of labor. Julián Orozco, en paz descanse, también uno de los cofundadores, al igual que Jesse López. En fact, Jesse López hizo la resolución como supervisor del condado en ese tiempo, para que se reconociera y se formalizó. Pero empezó en 1978, brevemente, un día y medio, pero se formalizó con esa resolución oficialmente, formalmente, 1980, gracias a esos 3 nombres que mencioné, Siggy, don Julián y don López, Jesse López. Así es de que, let me ask you, Mr. Humberto, do you consider yourself a bad hombre?
No, but it all depends who you ask. No, I don't. In fact, no. Some people have called me a good man. Others people, they don't even know me, and it would never been important enough, I guess, to be labeled one way or another.
Yes, and sometimes I do ask the question because, again, Hispanics have been categorized as criminals or bad hombres, rapists, and so forth. And it's important for them to see that we have Hispanic writers, mayors, lawyers, educators, and a lot of times we have to change that image that yes, there are professionals, we can succeed given the right opportunities as well.
Of course, the education is a fantastic avenue to overcome discrimination and to overcome poverty. Probably the worst form of racism there is, or the worst form of evil there is, it's poverty. Poverty, causes a lot of problems, not only for the poor people, but also for the people that have to live nearby them, because nobody in the right mind is going to let their kids die or starve. They'll do whatever it takes to feed them.
Yes,
and that's why in this country, as racist as it is yet, it's still a lot better than other places, because at least here, you can work your way out of it, out of poverty.
Yes, and talking about the contribution, I want to ask you your perspective of immigrants, because a lot of times it's easy to use immigrants, our agricultural workers, as a drag on social programs. And let me say this, that right now hay muchas familias que están preocupadas porque se viene a la mesa el fin del TPS, que tienen miedo, que no pueden encontrar su voz, que a veces no saben cómo ejercer sus derechos, porque todos queremos crear nuestras familias, que vayan a la escuela, que aprovechen la educación. Education is a game changer to improve the way of life of many immigrant families.
Yes. Hard work and education are probably the best way to improve the quality of life for anybody, and you can do it within one generation. I have relatives that we were dirt poor. We were migrant farm workers, and we are not out of it yet, but at least some of us became professionals, and we did better than most. But we worked hard, and we studied hard, and in some cases, I don't think a lot of the people, especially the white people, liked us, but they don't have to like you. You don't need them to like you. You just have to work harder. That's all.
Yes, and obviously follow the law. I want to take time to say that there's a business in San Joaquin. Se vende un negocio en San Joaquin, Farm Feed Store Supply. Puede hablar con Arturo Peña a la área 559-633-3665. Es la única, el único negocio que en la área que provee comida, alimentos para la granja, los animales de granja. Así es de que le pueden llamar una vez más, gracias al apoyo de García's Market en Kerman, donde encuentra todo tipo de alimentos y, cómo no, también buena carnita que se vende por allá. Un saludo y un apoyo para Víctor Martínez, candidato para alcalde, vicealcalde ahorita de Mendota, y corriendo también para seguir en ayuntamiento, a Espi Sandoval, que está buscando ser el alcalde de Kerman, California. Así es de que TJ Cox, apoyamos a TJ Cox, que siga trayendo esos fondos, mejorando el agua en Parlier y ayudando a nuestros veteranos. Tú también eres oficial electo. Quiero que nos cuentes tu experiencia como oficial electo de Sanger.
Well, I ran for the wrong reason, but we had a mayor that was a crook, and he needed to be removed, and I had done the research on him, and the only way to do it was to be inside, and that's why I ran for office. And once I ran for office, I found out that there were a lot of other things that needed to change. So once you start scratching, there's always more work to be done, and it's been an honor to be in the city council, and I've been there now 6 years, going on 7, and I've grown to like it. I didn't necessarily like politicians. I don't think you can trust them. But there's a lot of work to be done yet, and somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to do it. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of room for improvement.
Ya ven, ya lo escucharon aquí en la hora de la verdad, que él quería traer cambio a Sanger y tuvo que correr. A veces tenemos que ser nosotros el cambio y tomar acción para ver ese cambio que queremos ver. Por último, ¿qué le recomiendas a esa gente que no vota, que a veces tiene sus dudas? ¿Cómo vamos a cambiar nuestra sociedad? ¿Cómo la vamos a mejorar? Con eso cerramos.
There is no reason why anybody should not vote. I can't think of a good reason why nobody should vote. If you don't like the candidates, then you run. But you need to vote. You need to vote. You need to represent yourself and show your kids. Because in the democracy, it's participatory. If you don't participate, you don't belong in the democracy.
Ya lo escucharon aquí en la hora de la verdad. Si no te gusta cómo están corriendo las cosas en tu comunidad, pues tienes que correr y aventarte de candidatura. Recuerden, como Joaquin Murrieta buscando justicia, queremos buscar justicia a través del voto, la involucración y participación cívica. Así es de que vota, no importa por quién votas, ojalá que votes por los mejores candidatos que te van a traer ese cambio, sino tú mismo, tú misma, hombre o mujer, todos tenemos el mismo derecho en esta gran nación. Hasta la próxima, lo escucharon aquí, la autoridad en Joaquin Murrieta, Humberto Garza, gracias por estar aquí, es un gran placer.
Gracias.
Hasta pronto.